Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. A very warm welcome to all participants around the world to the Global Fleet Summit APAC 2021. My name is Ming, and I will be one of the speakers at today's event. The topic I will talk about today is how to develop a regional Asia-Pacific strategy or APAC strategy. But before we go into that, let me just do a quick introduction of myself. So my full name is Ng Yit Ming, or for easier pronunciation, you can just call me Ming. I am working for Nestle and located in the procurement hub based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, one of the two. The other two are based in Switzerland as well as Panama City. My official title is the Regional Category Manager for Zone AOA, which stands for Asia, Oceania, and Africa for the vehicle fleet. And my experience prior to Nestle is in the Australian automotive industry. I've had a stint in procurement, logistics, as well as supply chain. A little bit about the overview for Nestle. Nestle is the largest food and beverage company in the world. It has a presence of 190 countries, which is most of the globe. And finally, from a global car fleet or fleet perspective, we have about 23,000 vehicles across the globe. In terms of the model which we use, we have lease and purchase. We are more focusing on the leasing aspect, but at the same time, where we are not able to purchase is the option, or it's more beneficial for Nestle as a company. In terms of the vehicle breakdown, we have a majority of them are sales vehicles, but we also have the management vehicles, or rather known as the benefit vehicles as well. A little bit of information about APAC or Asia Pacific as a whole. From a population standpoint, there are 44.3 billion people, which is roughly 60% of the world population. Definitely not a small amount in any way, shape, or form. In terms of the sales volumes for vehicles, it roughly averages about 40 million cars per year. And from a maturity level, it is quite a wide and diverse range. We have emerging markets, but we also have developed markets. So as you can imagine, both ends of the spectrum are available in Asia Pacific. And from a supplier point of view, from the leasing companies as well as the manufacturers, you have global suppliers, you have regional, and you have local. So it's, again, a very wide spectrum in terms of what is available and what's not. Now, on to the topic, how to develop a regional APAC strategy. What I've done is that I've put it down into three simple and digestible steps, which I believe are quite important. Firstly, the step number one is to prepare, or essentially to identify your requirements. Step number two would be to create. And when I talk about create, it's essentially the roadmap for your strategy, how to achieve it, as well as some information on supplier management, because that's also key in terms of developing the strategy. And finally, the third and last step is essentially to deploy it. And when I mean deploy, stakeholder approval and implementation. Besides those things, I would also give you a little bit of the key insights in terms of the APAC challenges and tips to solve them. And finally, my personal take on the future of the region as a whole. So let's get started with step one. Step one, as I said, was prepare. Essentially, identify your requirements. Now, there are a few things to note. When you start a project to review how things are to be done, where you want to achieve, the key thing is that you need to understand on the internal side first, or the organizational priorities. Going into this fleet project, what does your organization look to achieve and want from it? Is it in terms of cost, in terms of improving safety, in terms of reducing CO2 emissions, which is the environment, or maybe a combination of all three of them or more. That's the first thing you need to identify in terms of the requirements. The second part essentially is what I call the data collection stage. And this is a key stage and very, very important because without accurate data, you are going to have a very difficult time trying to create a strategy or to even identify what you want, because you need to know what the spend of your fleet is, what's the current size, do you have more lease, do you have more purchase, what is it essentially? And with that information, it will help you craft and map where you want to add up with. The next point is stakeholder engagement. I find this to be one of the most important points because without clear stakeholder engagement, your project will have a very difficult time, and is also likely not to succeed to the standard you want. Essentially, you need to get all the stakeholders involved, and depending on companies, they could be different stakeholders in different departments which manage car fleet. So I've picked the most prominent ones, which are HR, finance, facility management, as well as the procurement team. So in getting good getting good stakeholder engagement is very, very key. Do not forget that. The next part I'll talk about is the scope and coverage. So identify what are you going to be covering within your strategy. Are you only going to be covering passenger vehicles? Will you cover light commercial vehicles, heavy commercial vehicles? What is considered motorbikes, tricycles, armored vehicles? You need to define this together with your stakeholders on what specifically will be covered, which will make management a lot easier. The next part of it I'll talk about is the finance side. And when I talk about finance side, it's more to do with what your company wants. So usually in a case where you purchase vehicles, it's usually done outright, as it's better from a purchase point of view. But of course, when you do it outright and you purchase it immediately like that, there's a lot of capital outlay. You need to understand if firstly your company is willing to make that investment, and if it fits in. The other side of it, if you don't purchase, there's obviously the lease. So leasing, in many cases, you pay on a monthly basis, so you kind of spread the amount of payments which you need to make. That's very key. And also in the finance side, you need to identify what type of payment terms you would essentially like your suppliers to be on. The last part of it essentially is the duration for the policy of your vehicles. How long do you want your vehicles to be on? Industry practice usually is between a minimum of 3 years and a maximum of 5 years. And the reasoning behind that is that 3 years is the minimum amount to make the leasing option viable. And 5 years is usually the optimal amount, because after 5 years, the warranty periods run out. Free servicing is usually over. So all these and new vehicles which are more efficient come up in the market. So all these factors play into the part in terms of the residual value at the end of it. So that's why I say 3 to 5 years. So again, really depends on what your market wants. Now, the second part of it I will talk about is to create. So in creating, I'm talking about the roadmap of fleet strategy, as well as the approach to achieve it. The strategy creation in any type, way, or form, you need to know what is the duration of it. So you need to have a short-term goal, a medium-term goal, and a long-term goal. In the case for car fleet, I would say short-term is 1 to 2 years, medium-term is 3 to 4 years, and long-term is 5 years and above. So as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, that's a little bit of an example of what you can do. So for example, in the company, let's say what I want to achieve in the first 2 years. I want to do a global tender, and I want to identify the strategic supplier alliances I would like to partner with. In the medium term, I would like to run out a global policy, which the markets will follow, and as well as hybrid vehicles at a minimum. as you are aware, we're all about fuel efficiency and environmental sustainability. All companies are moving in this direction, and that's the way forward as well. From a long-term perspective, moving those hybrid vehicles into fully electric vehicles, let's say, for example. And finally, the net zero emissions target. So you would notice globally more and more companies and countries are coming out with the initiative to reduce their emissions. After that, the other thing to also identify very clearly is to understand the market specificities. So when I talk about this, I'm talking about internal and external. And internal can be what is your market policy? What is the direction you want to go in? Are we able to financially go with purchase vehicles, or do we look at lease? From the external side would be things like tax regulations, supplier landscape, uh, maturity of leasing companies, legal implications. So all these things need to be identified when you are developing and creating your strategy. Once you have created that and have some internal alignment, the next part of it is how do you achieve it? So as I mentioned, you need to have your stakeholder engagement from the very beginning. It's key and critical, as these people will be approving your strategy which you roll out. I would recommend globally, regionally, and at a local level. When all are aligned, it makes things happen a lot easier, and you would get a lot of less resistance. There will be some change management which is required, but the key thing is that the organization is moving in the same direction. The next thing as well is to have key deliverables. And when I talk about this, it's about having them at each milestone by team as well as individual. You need to make sure that people are responsible, know their responsibility, and can be accountable. And that's when you know how things, milestones, and projects will be delivered. So that's very key. How you achieve this: have frequent meetings with your stakeholders, build a rapport, build a relationship with your local stakeholders at the market, or sorry, not or, as well as your suppliers. This is very, very key. Now I'll talk about the next part, and it's also in terms of creating the full strategy, is supply management. You need to identify and map out the landscape of the suppliers. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, who are the global, regional, or local partners you want to partner with to make your strategy a success. I'll give you some examples on the right-hand side. As you can see, the manufacturers as well as the leasing companies. In Asia Pacific, if you just do a quick Google search, you will find all the usual suspects over here. But yeah, these are some of the players in the market. There are more. So when you do your research, you will be able to see these suppliers there. The other key thing as well, I always mention, is that you need to have your supplier onboarded in terms of what you want to achieve. Tell them, say, educate them. This is the structure of our business. This is the way stakeholders operate. This is the way I would operate. The culture in the company. Understand them so that they can help you also carrying out what you want to put forth. The other thing as well, as I always mention, of course, now with COVID, this might not be so possible, but if you can, visit your suppliers, visit your stakeholders. Face-to-face meetings are usually the best. As much as we like technology, technology only brings us so far. But as I mentioned, if you're able to visit them in person, or even if your local stakeholders are able to visit the supplier in person, organize a meeting, get them to do it. Obviously, once COVID is in a little bit better situation. The final thing about this part I would like to talk about is the business continuity plan. And when I talk about this is that when you select a supplier, you need to ensure that your supplier is able to support you in good times, but also in bad times. And a very good example is during COVID. If you don't have a good relationship with your supplier, or your supplier is not able to do it, you essentially have big problems. So when you go through your strategy, make sure you have this and keep it in mind and ask your suppliers about this as well. All right. Going on to the third and final point, once you have identified and developed the strategy, is to deploy it. So pretty straightforward over here. You need stakeholder approval and you need to implement it. Stakeholder approval, present, seek approval from the key decision makers. And this is what I talked about earlier, is the involvement and alignment is key. Once that's all done, you essentially need to implement the strategy. And in most cases, when I talk about implementation, you will need to carry out a tendering. It can be done through a traditional tendering process, or you could go for an e-auction, which is an online auction platform, or a direct negotiation. It really depends what your strategy is and how you want to carry it out. But again, keep your stakeholders aligned throughout the process so that when a business is awarded, they are aware of what's going on. And the last part of it, after everything is implemented, you need to ensure that you can report to the business what the key deliverables and track the results, because a success in one market will translate to a success in another market when they see the benefits. And these benefits can be both tangible in terms of they can see it, its savings, its money, or intangible results. So efficiency benefits in terms of operationally, as well as the other benefits which come along with a successful tendering process. And so now I've talked about the first three steps in terms of what needs to be done. I like to move on to a little bit about some of the challenges which I see and tips to resolve them. So firstly, each market is on a very different maturity level in Asia Pacific. And what I mean is one size does not fit all. Customization will be required. So keep this in mind. You will need to tweak it based on the market's requirements. Number two, best practices sometimes in Europe and the Americas are not very common in Asia Pacific. So you might be used to speaking to a supplier in Europe, and when you try to translate that into the supplier in Asia Pacific, they will literally be able to be not sure what you're talking about or just say that's not industry practice. This can be quite common. My advice to that is to take the best practices where possible and implement it. So discuss and negotiate with your supplier. The next topic I'd like to talk about is cultural understanding. So cultural understanding is very key in this market because you need to essentially know what the cultural norms are. So do you push your supplier? Do you have a very good relationship? In some cases, maybe you need to be firm, and that's the culture of the market. So that's what essentially you need to be aware of. Point number 4, organizational hierarchy can make decision making a little bit challenging in the Asia Pacific region, and I will probably leave out the Australia and New Zealand and some of the other countries because they're relatively in the Western mindset. This can be an issue. I'm not saying it will be, but it can be because it's still a very hierarchical system. So the key thing to that is to identify what are the objectives and motivation for management to support your decision. Lobby and make sure that you have all your facts in place and the benefits for moving. That's my advice for that. And finally, the last thing, it's quite common in a lot of the markets where they have very high taxes, and this taxes is specifically import tax if the vehicle is not produced locally. So one of the ways to overcome this is to introduce a locally assembled vehicle where possible. Just one very quick example, I don't need to go far. Malaysia is a very good example. If you import any vehicle into Malaysia, which is a fully built unit, tax is very, very high compared to something which is locally assembled. This next slide I'll talk about essentially is the future outlook of what I see in the market. In Asia Pacific, emerging markets will continue to grow. Population and wealth growth is definitely here. So I see the trend only going up. Governments will continue to essentially push for the electrification drive. And it's not immediate, as you can see with the numbers. Example, Singapore has kind of committed by 2040 to have all electric vehicles. China by 2060 net zero emissions. But besides that, you also see markets where governments are starting to invest heavily and incentivize foreign investment for the manufacturers. So Indonesia is one of them. Thailand is one of them. They want to be the leading production hubs of electric vehicles. On a global scale, manufacturers will continue to roll out more fuel-efficient vehicles. This can be in form of hybrid, plug-in hybrid, or even the fully electric vehicles. This will only continue, and we have seen some bold statements by some manufacturers in terms of moving into this direction more and more. And finally, from an organizational point of view, the organization is going to essentially continue with sustainability commitments to reduce CO2 and achieve net zero carbon emissions in some cases, as with the climate group, the EV100. So more companies are going in this direction. It's not something which can be stopped. We essentially need to figure out how do we get there. Now, very quickly on the key takeaways in terms of the presentation before I wrap up. Stakeholder engagement and alignment is very key to your successful implementation. Accurate data collection is a must. Remember, one size does not fit all, and customization will be required. The cultural aspect and the understanding is also very, very key in the markets in APAC. And finally, hybrid and electrification are coming. There's no doubt about that. So be prepared for it. And when you prepare for it, I'm sure you'll be able to deal with it when it comes. So with that, I would like to say thank you very much for your time. Again, my name is Ming. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me through email. I have it on the screen there. And just before I leave, I would like to leave you with a quote which resonates quite well with me. It's by the late Steve Jobs from Apple. He essentially said, if you really look closely, most overnight successes take a long time. For the aspect of fleet in Asia Pacific, I think that truly sums it up very well. It's not something which can be done overnight. It takes a lot of hard work, dedication, and effort, but with all the right tools in place, and I hope that the tips which I've given you, that should help you along your journey. And finally, you'll be able to have a great strategy within the APAC region. So with that, thank you again very much for your time. Stay safe, take care, and hope to see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.